Why don't we go ahead and get started? I see that people are still trickling in. Good day to everyone. Good morning to those of you on the East Coast of the United States. Good evening to those of you joining from Asia, as a couple of our panelists are in between. My name is Benjamin Hopkins, and I'm the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. And it's my privilege to welcome you all today to our roundtable, our Taiwan roundtable on the U.S. elections and implications for Taiwan moving forward. This is a part of our regular series about Taiwan, which we're conducting monthly at this point via WebEx. They've been extraordinarily successful and well attended, and I see that this one is going to be in keeping with that tradition. Before I turn it over to our distinguished panelists and my colleague moderator, Deepa Alapalli, just a couple of quick ground rules. This is being recorded, and we will have it posted on the website once we clean up the recording and stuff. There is an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. On the right-hand side of your WebEx window, you should see a Q&A dialog box. If you can please put your questions in there. If you have a question to a specific panelist, please identify them. Otherwise, we'll take it to the panel as a whole. And also, if you could identify yourself in your question, just so we know where it's coming from. With that said, I will turn it over to my colleague, Deepa Alapalli, who's going to chair and moderate this fantastic event. Over to you, Deepa.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome, everybody. I think we're in for a real treat today. One of the early assessments of this big change that we are seeing in Washington, D.C. We do have, I expect, a full house, which you can't see because we're not in person, but more than 150 people have registered for this event, and I think that's a great testimony to the topic as well as to our esteemed panelists. Well, it's exactly 1 month since November 7th when the major news outlets all declared Biden as the victor. Now, already we've seen Mr. Biden announce several key foreign policy picks, including Tony Blinken for Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, and most recently, Lloyd Austin for Defense Secretary. So I think we have enough to start reading the tea leaves to think about what the implications are for Taiwan and under the Biden administration. There are, of course, high stakes involved for Taiwan in this transition of administrations in Washington. A change of guard could bring about a lot of changes or not. So one of the key issues will be the extent to which the Biden administration will continue what has generally been seen as a very favorable policy under Trump administration toward Taiwan. And many of us are questioning to what extent how Biden will be assessing China and how he will move forward on looking at Chinese policy, and to what extent it's linked to Taiwan questions. You know, whether it will be closely tied to how the Washington looks at China, or it will see Taiwan as a kind of a more autonomous actor with its own importance, given the fact that it had a superb performance in handling the pandemic, its potential role in supply chain security, and of course, democracy, which is, I think, a big value for the incoming administration. So that said, now, the bottom line is how much change, how much continuity. And so as a political scientist, I know that when I make any predictions, it's an occupational hazard. But this is exactly what I've sort of asked my panelists to do today, is to look into their crystal ball and at least give us some speculations that they can make about the new administration and what that might mean for Taiwan along a number of different dimensions. And I'm really delighted to say that I have an incredible panel here. Two panelists who are from right here in Washington, D.C., and two others who are all the way from Taiwan. It's past 10 p.m. there. And I just want to give a special thanks to the two from Taiwan for joining us, taking the time to do this for us. To set the stage, what I've done is I'm going to ask the two US-based panelists to kick it off, followed by our friends in Taiwan. So now it's my enormous pleasure to introduce the panelists and as well as the discussant. So we have 4 speakers here. So in order of appearance will be my colleague at GW, Bob Sutter, who is a professor of politics, practice of international relations at the Elliott School. And Bob is an incredible author, published widely. Most recently, he just published the book, Chinese Foreign Relations, Power and Policy in an Emerging Global Force, 5th edition, and he just had his book launch 2 days ago here. So he's been very busy this week. He has major experience in the government and in the Congressional Research Service, as well as in the intelligence community, and academia. So he will start us off with presidential change in Washington, continuity or change. So heading headlong into the question that I posed at the beginning. Next, following Bob, I'm absolutely thrilled to have a rare view from Congress, a senior expert from Congress to help us think through what the congressional views are on Taiwan moving forward. And we have Sarah Trister. She is the foreign policy advisor for Senator Edward Markey. He's a Democrat from Massachusetts, and he is the lead Democrat on the East Asia subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so which is a very crucial subcommittee. So I think it'll be interesting to see what she has to say about her boss's views and her own. She has had a lot of experience in Congress, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Congressman David Cicilline, where she was also his foreign policy advisor. She's also previously worked as a senior advocacy manager at Freedom House, and she is currently a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. So welcome, Sarah. She's got a very busy schedule, and I'm really pleased that she could fit this in. Following those two, we then switch sides and turn to the speakers from Taiwan. And they're going to be, I'll start with Hung Jeng Wang. He is going to talk to us about Taiwan's perspectives on the challenges and opportunities under Biden. And he's an associate professor of political science at the National Cheng Kung University. And he was also, I'm happy to say, he was a non-resident scholar at Sigur Center and at the East Asia National Resource Center. He's also been a Fulbright scholar. He has also written quite a lot, including his latest book, which is called China and International Theory, The Balance of Relationships. He's done a lot of visiting research positions in the US and in Europe. Finally, last but not least, we have a discussant who is going to give us his take on the speaker's comments, as well as some of his own commentary. And for that, we have Lev Nachman, who's also in Taiwan at the moment. He's a visiting scholar at National Taiwan University. He was formerly a visiting scholar at the Global Taiwan Institute, and also he's had a Fulbright scholarship to Taiwan. And he's actually a PhD candidate right now at the University of California in Irvine. He has published already extensively in places like the Washington Post Foreign Policy, the Diplomat, East Asia Forum. So quite an enviable record for a PhD candidate. He's also quite an avid dynamic tweeter, or on Twitter, he tweets a lot. So if you want to find out what's going on in Taiwan, he might be a good person to follow. All right. Well, having said that, I want to now turn it over to my colleague Bob. They will all speak, the panelists will all speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, followed by about 5 to 7 minutes by Lev. So we will get to all your questions in due time. But meanwhile, please help me welcome Bob Sutter.
Thanks very much, Deepa. It's really a pleasure for me to be part of this distinguished panel. And your introduction helps me to save a little time. This is the issue I want to focus on. Basically, we've had remarkable change in American policy toward Taiwan during the Trump administration. There been a whole series of advances that were really, in many cases, unprecedented. They were incremental. They seemed to be in line with the One China policy in a very broad definition of the One China policy, but they were remarkable nonetheless, military, diplomatic, and economic advances. And so the key question is, will the Biden administration, will they continue? Will we see more advances? And as we know, there's a lot of concern in Taiwan that this won't happen. And some of that, I think, is quite justified. So I'm going to talk about that. But basically, what I'm going to do is talk about the underlying drivers and the underlying brakes on further advances in U.S. relations with Taiwan. And then I have a few comments on the personnel of the Biden administration, their record up to this point, and the narratives that we're seeing today about the Biden administration, what it's likely to do vis-a-vis Taiwan, coming from people close to the Biden camp and in the Biden camp. And in the end, I'm going to give something to watch for. Those of you that are watching for what might happen with Taiwan under the Biden government, some things you can look at. So let's look at the drivers first. And these drivers are strong for the United States to continue a strong, robust interaction with Taiwan on a whole range of issues, even where Beijing objects. Because why? Beijing keeps its pressure up on Taiwan. They're changing the status quo. So the U.S. is trying to keep the balance in the status quo. It's trying to sustain the status quo by taking actions counter to Beijing's pressures. Taiwan's location. This is very important in existing U.S. strategy. The Indo-Pacific strategy highlights Taiwan's position, geographic position, in dealing with Beijing in a highly competitive environment. And then Taiwan's values, democracy, good governance, free market economy, and Taiwan as a node of a high technology importance. All of these things make the United States government being more interested in Taiwan than they have been in the past. And also in this period, and the Trump administration, you had an approach of imposing costs on China, using Taiwan to impose costs on China. You advance in the South China Sea, we're going to advance in a relationship with Taiwan. I'm not so sure how much that is going to persist. The others, I think, will persist in the United States under the Biden administration. But that driver may be muted somewhat. The idea that you would somehow link the Taiwan issue with another type of dissatisfaction with Beijing. Let's look at the brakes, too. And the brakes in the past, the main brake had been in the past that you didn't want to disrupt your relationship with Beijing because it was a very important relationship and to move forward in sensitive areas with Taiwan. The Trump administration just threw that away. They were disrupting the relationship with Beijing all the time. And so that was really overtaken by events. In addition, the U.S. wanted its allies and partners to be on their side in dealing with various issues, and those countries didn't want to see the U.S. disrupt the relationship with Beijing over Taiwan. But the U.S. government has disrupted the relationship with Beijing on a whole host of issues, and so that's also been overtaken by events. In these areas, you get a sense that the Biden administration probably doesn't want to have big trouble with China. Will they take steps that would actually the Biden people would value a stable relationship with China? And that's a hypothesis, I think has some evidence behind it. And so therefore, this break may be a little more important for the Biden people than it was for the Trump people. The other main break, of course, in moving forward with Taiwan is Beijing's use of force. Beijing may start conflict and so forth. And this remains a very powerful break, moving too fast, too far in dealing with Taiwan. So those are my view of the brakes and the drivers and the brakes. And I think there's some modification that I see here. But the drivers are very strong, and the brakes are not as strong. But there are a few, like wanting stability with China, which could slow or possibly reduce the kinds of advances that might be taking place in US-Taiwan relations. Now let's take a look at the Biden camp, and this is complicated because it's a very big tent. You have all sorts of people in the Biden camp, but Deepa mentioned Mr. Blinken, Mr. Sullivan, and we have Mr. Prescott is also getting a lot of publicity as well. And these individuals are all veterans of the Obama administration. They have a strong background in managing the Taiwan issue in the way that it was done in the Obama administration. That's what worries people in Taiwan, that will return. This strict construction of the one China policy, which the Obama government followed, is something that would definitely restrict a lot of the things that the Trump government has been doing with Taiwan. And so the record of Mr. Obama was very strong in this regard, a very strict construction. He was angry with Beijing over the South China Sea, over cyber theft. He didn't let it spill over and change his policy toward Taiwan. The rebalance policy was very important, but they were very muted in talking about what exactly Taiwan would do in the rebalance policy. So there was an avoiding of controversy, keeping Taiwan issue carefully managed. And carefully managed meant keeping it out of sensitive areas that would complicate the relationship with Beijing. After Mr. Obama left, and then we had the election of 2016, and Mr. Sullivan, very important in the Clinton campaign, announced to the media there would be no change in policy toward Taiwan under the Clinton administration. If Hillary Clinton had won the election, she would follow the same sort of policy, is what he implied in his statements at that time. And the background here, too, isn't suggest of the Democrats, suggests that they're not inclined to do strong things vis-a-vis China in many respects. That's changed over time, but if you looked at up to 2019, through 2019, the candidates were all they didn't have a sense of urgency about China. And Mr. Sullivan was on record in July of talking about how the people of the in July 2019, that the people of the United States don't want a real hard relationship with China. And the candidates reflected that kind of public opinion. And that was the public opinion at that time. It was accurate at that time. So the point is they're new to this tougher policy toward China. And presumably, if the tougher policy toward China is something that motivates you to be stronger in support of Taiwan, which seems to be the case in the Trump government, therefore they may not be as strong in moving in this. It's a new thing for them. But you get a counter-narrative, and the counter-narrative is coming out from different individuals who are close to the Biden government. Kurt Campbell did this just a day or two ago. And here you say, oh, we really value Taiwan. It's a very important partner. And so there's a lot of reassurance coming publicly from these folks, which is important. You'll notice there's not any reassurance coming to Beijing. So they are reassuring Taiwan, and they're not reassuring Beijing publicly. So this is a significant development. And so the upshot here is that, but Mr. Biden has made clear he doesn't want an FTA with Taiwan. And that's a very big issue for Taiwan. That's something that they seem to want, and that apparently is not going to happen for the time being. So looking out, what's the likelihood of a strong action on the part of the Biden government to continue these very remarkable changes in America's policy toward Taiwan that have been carried out by the Trump government? Obviously, the China policy looms large here. And will Biden change his China policy? And I think the short answer is probably not. Not for now. It's the country has moved, public opinion has moved, the Congress has moved in a very negative direction. If he were to ease tensions with China without a compensating action on the part of Beijing anytime soon, he would get a lot of blowback from the Republicans in the Congress. And I think the Democrats in the Congress, in many cases, while they might be party loyalists, would be unhappy with this kind of a situation. And so here, and this would cause a lot of controversy at a time when Mr. Biden doesn't need controversy, when he needs support to deal with the pandemic, to deal with the economy and these kinds of issues. So it argues that probably China policy, there won't be a big concession anyway toward Beijing to ease tensions with Beijing. I could be wrong, but that's the way I see it right now. However, Taiwan can be a special case, as it was in the late Obama period. It was handled very strictly. Even though they were angry with China over other issues, Taiwan didn't get that attention. And so you could see less going on with Taiwan from the U.S. government because it would antagonize Beijing. And they don't want to antagonize Beijing. They don't want to make the situation worse with Beijing, with the argument. Now, how do you do this? If you do it in a way that says, well, Trump did this and we're not going to do it anymore, I think that would be very direct and would lead to the type of controversy that I'm talking about in Congress and in the media and maybe even in public opinion about dealing with this issue. But if you just stop doing things, let them atrophy a little bit. You don't stop them completely. You just don't do them as frequently. You don't do them with high profile, and you don't do new things. That's the thing I'm watching for. Is that what they'll do in dealing with Taiwan? And this is something that people in Taiwan who want strong support from the United States, they might not like this. So it remains to be seen. Obviously, this counter narrative that's coming out from the Biden camp is very reassuring in lots of ways, but it doesn't really show that they're going to do hard things that might antagonize Beijing. Seriously. And that's in the Trump government, that was done repeatedly. And so I'm waiting to see how this is carried out. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see atrophy in several areas. Doesn't mean not strong, and they'll be active in lots of ways, but it won't be to the extent that it has been in the past, and it will avoid added controversy in U.S. relations with Beijing. So we've been asked to forecast. I have forecasted, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for that terrific kickoff, Bob. You couldn't have set the stage better. Now over to Sarah for a congressional view.
Thank you, Deepa. Can you see me okay? Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the Sigur Center and GW for hosting us today and inviting me to speak about Congress's role in the US-Taiwan relationship. Professor Sutter had a very interesting point of view to present. I'm going to represent the congressional view to the best of my ability. It's my pleasure to talk about the friendship between US and Taiwan. And I'm speaking on behalf of my boss, Senator Ed Markey, for whom I serve as the Foreign Policy Advisor, and he is the ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as Deepa mentioned, and he's been a strong supporter of Taiwan throughout his time in Congress. And Taiwan is one of those rare issues on which there is widespread bipartisan agreement from Congress. One of the only other areas I've seen that agreement is that the House has better lunch options. This is a rare area in which, there's not a lot of daylight between the two sides. Congress passed the landmark Taiwan Relations Act in 1979, cementing the unofficial US-Taiwan relationship, and that set the tone for bilateral relations between us for the next 4 decades. And that bipartisan support for Taiwan has remained strong in Congress and between the US and Taiwan, and Congress has been instrumental in cementing that relationship. Taiwan was a leading donor of PPE and other supplies to the United States and other countries around the world as we fight the coronavirus pandemic. And as a country of only 23 million people, Taiwan consistently punches above its weight globally, and it could play an even greater role if China didn't shut it out of international organizations, notably the World Health Organization. So Senator Markey, like many members of Congress, has embraced Taiwan. And as ranking member of the East Asia Subcommittee, he's worked with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure our support for Taiwan. And our work to push back against China's worst actions has remained robust and bipartisan. Senator Markey, along with Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, who's the chair of the Asia Subcommittee, passed landmark legislation in the last Congress, the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, known as ARIA. And this bill tried to orient the United States Asia policy around a framework to enhance U.S. leadership in the Indo-Pacific region and to demonstrate a commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific and the rules-based international order. And Senator Markey has been a leading voice for a concerted U.S. policy towards the region based on broad acceptance and promotion of universal values, combating authoritarianism, and standing up for key American allies in order to address serious challenges. And ARIA was an important step in that direction, and it directly led to millions of dollars being appropriated for U.S. foreign assistance, to strengthen alliances and partnerships, promote resource conservation, pursue effective arms control and non-proliferation policies, commit the U.S. government to the full implementation of sanctions on North Korea and its enablers, and help ensure U.S. leadership in the region continues. And Taiwan was a key component of the ARIA strategy. The legislation recognized the close economic, political, and security relationship between Taiwan and the United States, and it reaffirmed our dedication to ensuring that U.S. policy continues to oppose any efforts to change the status quo outside of a peacefully negotiated agreement. So unfortunately, as Professor Sutter mentioned, we've seen over the last few years an increase in China's aggressive rhetoric and actions in the region. We know China attempted to interfere in the free and fair elections earlier this year in Taiwan. Thankfully, they were largely unsuccessful, but they were vocal and visible in a way that was deeply, deeply concerning. China has increased its flyovers and naval activity in and around the Taiwan Strait. And of course, China's flagrant disregard for the one country, two systems framework governing Hong Kong and its crackdown against the pro-democracy movement there has led to growing concern that they will place an even bigger target on Taiwan. China's increased aggression and brazenness in the region has only strengthened support for Taiwan in Congress. While the parties may disagree on rhetoric and tactics, there is widespread agreement that the U.S. friendship and support for Taiwan remain strong and must continue to remain strong. Earlier this year, as one example, Senator Markey introduced bipartisan legislation that will deepen this friendship even further. This bill is called the Taiwan Fellowship Act, and it's modeled on the successful Mansfield Fellowship Program between the United States and Japan, and it will establish a 2-year fellowship exchange program for federal government employees in all 3 branches of the U.S. government to live, learn, and work in Taiwan. And upon successful conclusion of the program, fellows will return to federal government service, better positioned to advance U.S. values and interests in the Indo-Pacific, with a special emphasis on strengthening our strategic partnership with Taiwan. The bill does have bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, and we hope to pass it soon so we can continue to strengthen the bonds between Taiwan and the United States. One effort in which China has unfortunately seen some success in its campaign against Taiwan has been its attempts to exclude Taiwan from international organizations and its pressure campaign against countries and private businesses to recognize their one China policy. Senator Markey recently led a bipartisan letter to the Director General of the World Health Organization, expressing disappointment that the WHO excluded Taiwan from the second session of the World Health Assembly due to China's pressure. And Senator Markey strongly believes that one area in which the United States must focus its efforts in a more coordinated way is in countering Chinese influence at the UN and other institutions, including the WHO, and in doing so, helping raise Taiwan's profile in those organizations. And this is an area where I fully expect the Biden administration to take strong initiative right out of the gate. And we must ensure that the U.S. is well represented at all levels within the bodies that govern our norms and international institutions, including trade, intellectual property, cybersecurity, human rights, and more. And the Trump administration's withdrawal from some and devaluing of other of these institutions left a vacuum that Chinese and Russians were happy to fill. And one of the Chinese government's chief goals in these institutions is to marginalize Taiwan. And they've attempted to do this by bullying companies into recognizing their one country policy and threatening to close their markets if companies don't comply. They've tried to strong arm smaller countries who want to benefit from Chinese investment in infrastructure. And so Senator Markey believes that it's time to offer a credible alternative to countries looking at the Chinese government for leadership for infrastructure and investment. And the United States must reestablish itself as a global leader, reaffirm our commitment to a values-based system founded on universal values. And they have a big set of challenges ahead. I'm confident they're assembling a team that is up for the task. President-elect Biden is clear-eyed about the threat China poses, but, and I think this is important, he's also open to cooperation in the areas in which we must find common ground, including climate, nuclear non-proliferation, and of course, combating disease. In terms of Taiwan, we will continue to grow that close relationship, investing in our economic, law enforcement, and security partnerships while working together to combat the pandemic, promote human rights, and the rule of law in the region. And Senator Markey, as the lead Democrat on the Asia Subcommittee, will continue to work with his colleagues on both sides of the aisle to grow and strengthen the US-Taiwan relationship and continue to look for ways to increase our partnership moving into the new Congress and moving into the Biden administration. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion and am very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for giving us that inside close-up from your perch at the in Congress. And I think given Senator Markey's position on the subcommittee, we're all going to be watching what he's going to do moving forward. And I know you'll have a big role in formulating that as well. All right, now it's my pleasure to invite Hung Jen, who is sitting in Taiwan. Hung Jen.
Yes.
You.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here today. Today, I would like to discuss how Taiwanese are reacting to Biden's election victory, as well as his current foreign policy team, which I think are mostly relevant to Taiwan's as well as Asia's interests. From this analysis, I think we can also understand what are Taiwan's perspectives on challenges, the opportunities in the Biden era. First of all, I would like to say that the term Taiwanese is so broad that I think no one can actually represent the whole view of Taiwan, which in my opinion is quite diverse and plural. For my analytical purposes, I would like to divide Taiwanese people into at least 3 groups according to whether they are intellectually familiar with Biden and his foreign policy or not. In the first group, I call it the general public. Most people have an impression in this group, have an impression that Biden has a very soft position toward PRC China due to the following facts, such as his family's financial investment in China and Biden's personal friendship with current Chinese President Xi Jinping. Even some people, Taiwanese people, they still believe that the current US election is a fraud, and Biden has not yet won the election. Maybe those stories are true or not. It's not the point here. I think the media actually play an important role in framing the general public view in Taiwan. As we have seen, several public polls have already shown that there is a very strong preference and support for Donald Trump than for Biden before the election day, or maybe even today. Therefore, I think it's in this type of group, very few Taiwanese people will show Biden the favor. So that's the first group. And for the second group, I call it the intellectual community. There is a debate among those people about whether Biden or Trump can bring actual benefit to both Taiwan and Asia. People who hold the positive view will argue that it is a good thing to see the new Biden administration going back in the sure hands of the establishment. For example, we see Mr. Blinken and Mr. Sullivan have decades of experiences in government. Besides, the new Biden administration is expected to have a strong belief in multilateralism, alliances, cooperation, and democracy. These three core values are very universal and fundamental to the revival of international order and the stability in the eyes of some people in Taiwan. In contrast, I think people who hold the negative view on Biden and his foreign policy team do not believe their determination to fight against China. This group, I believe, they think that Biden and his foreign policy team is actually responsible for China's current assertive behavior. Because of their appeasement policy conducted during the Obama administration. Besides, people holding this negative view do not believe that Biden or his team has the capability of regaining in leadership in multilateralism in Asia. For those people, actually, they think that it's quite easier for Biden to say than to promote multilateralism, since in the past few years, the US has lost its international credibility in the field of global governance. Beyond these two groups I just mentioned about, the third group is from the position of governmental side. I think the Taiwan government normally prefers a neutral position towards both the Republican and Democratic governments for the sake of Taiwan's own national interests. I believe initially the Taiwan government still doubted Biden's China policy compared with Trump's strong support for Taipei's resistance to the pressure from Beijing. However, after detailed research and information gathering, Taipei seems to have realized that Biden will continue to keep America's commitment to Taiwan. Besides, it's a good thing to see that Biden is strongly associated with those core principles, such as multilateralism, alliances, cooperation, democratic values, and human rights. All are that Taiwan has been pursuing for decades in the past. In other words, in my view, decision makers in Taipei, they realize that Taiwanese and the Democrats actually also shared the same ideas and the values. From the perspective of Taiwan officials and the politicians, Biden's new administration is also an opportunity to Taiwan. Even the election results may not be within some people's expectations. So that's kind of my analysis for those three groups regarding their perspectives toward Biden's foreign policy team, as well as Biden himself. And right now, I want to emphasize the challenge side. I think it's not only the challenge to Taiwan itself, but also the challenges I think, to the Asia as a whole. Right now, from my observations, I think actually the several core values that I just mentioned about, such as multilateralism, alliances, cooperation, democratic values, not praised by Biden and his team, are in disarray in Asia. For example, we see that China already signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, a free trade and multilateral framework with so many Asian countries. But we see no of US role here. So that's kind of the first problem for those Asian countries. Not to mention that recently we see Chinese foreign ministers Wang Yi visited Japan and visited South Korea. I think China tried to play some role between South Korea, Japan, and United States. And the second disarray, I think, regarding alliances, cooperations, Japan and South Korea, for example, they have already played a side set on strengthening economic cooperation with China. That means they don't want to put all efforts only on reliant the United States power. They also want to be close with China, especially in terms of their economic relationship. Finally, I think we are watching a US democracy crisis in Asia. That means the ability of the US to set an example to those Asia countries actually has been crippled by its domestic problems and the governmental dysfunctions, for example, to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, not to mention the current election disputes. So all of those things, I think, contributing to people's fear in Asia, as well as in Taiwan, regarding the stabilities in the post-US election era. So I welcome more comments and questions from the audience. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hang Jen, for that very thoughtful and nuanced analysis of what the thinking is in Taiwan. And perhaps we can get more into some of the opportunities that you see moving ahead as well. Well, now let's turn to our discussant, Lev Nachman, who's going to give his take on what's been said and what he's thinking, and what questions we ought to be thinking about as well. So, Lev, here's an easy task for you.
Yes, good morning. And I just want to start by thanking everyone for inviting me to be a discussant for this panel. I think we just heard three very important perspectives. One of hesitation, one of optimism, and then one of a very important perspective of what's happening from Taiwan. And I'll start with Professor Sutter. I think you very good explanation of why we should be a little bit hesitant about being too optimistic under the Biden administration, especially highlighting at the number of things and kind of the rate at how the US-Taiwan development has accelerated under Trump. What I'm interested in looking back at, though, is what exactly policies allowed the Trump administration to push for things like high-level diplomatic visits, discussions of free trade agreements. And I look back to the Taipei Act and to the Taiwan Travel Act that, to bring kind of Sarah's discussion into it, were bipartisan in support. And if you look at the contents of the Taipei Act, you see things like calling for high-level visits, calling for discussions of FTAs, advocating for Taiwan to join international organizations. And the Taipei Act isn't necessarily, it's not a Republican bill, it's a bipartisan bill. So I'm curious if you think there's a reason to be optimistic about the future based off of Taiwan's bipartisan history in Congress and looking at how it's really bipartisan policy that's allowed for the last 4 years to have developed such a strong US-Taiwan relation. Sarah, I appreciate you giving us a very good highlight of just how bipartisan Taiwan is. And I think it's important to recognize that China and Taiwan in the United States of 2020 are not the same as China, Taiwan, and the United States of 2016, let alone 2012. And that the way that we discuss China and discuss Taiwan in political rhetoric has just drastically changed. And to bring back something that Professor Sutter said, he said that Biden is not going to use Trump to antagonize Beijing like Trump did. And I'm curious about, how can a Biden administration frame Taiwan in a way that isn't just about antagonizing Beijing, but is in support of Taiwan for its own sake, in line with what you said about reestablishing the United States as a leader based off of universal values. How do we bring Taiwan back into political discussions that are not necessarily about just looking at it through a lens of a tool to antagonize Beijing? Finally, Hongzhen, I was here during the entire US election, and the three groups that you described, I think, are very on point. It's been very strange to see just how much Taiwan sticks out relative to other countries in the world as one of the only to have public opinion polls show drastic support for Trump relative to Biden. And even though Taiwan is a bipartisan issue, and even though I think you're correct in saying that the Tsai administration is likely supportive of whichever administration happens to be in office as long as they can work with them, what can Tsai do to improve Biden's image domestically for the sake of the US-Taiwan relationship? I'm reminded of the Pew Research survey that came out earlier this year that asked Taiwanese citizens how they feel about US-Taiwan relations. And earlier this year, we saw that Taiwanese people overwhelmingly are very in favor of US-Taiwan relations growing and developing. And I'm curious about if that might change under the current context of Biden not being popular in Taiwan, and what should Tsai do to kind of improve that image? And then from the US side, a player that I think is really left out of this conversation is Taiwan's unofficial ambassador, Xiaobi Kim, who already took a phone call with Tony Blinken, which I think is a optimistic sign to the future of US-Taiwan relations under Biden. But what can Xiaobi Kim do in the U.S. while she's there to help kind of improve kind of the Taiwanese public's perception of Biden and the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations? And I'll stop there for now. But I very much look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Lev, for raising these questions for our panelists and getting to some of the tough issues as well that they're going to have to deal with in Taiwan and in the U.S. So let me give a chance to the panelists now to respond to Lev's response to them. And let me start with Bob. First question.
I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to answer Lev's question about the importance of Congress in dealing in the administration's thinking about this issue. Congress has consistently been very supportive of Taiwan, I know, and so this has always been given. But of course, the activity of the Congress on Taiwan has increased, along with other areas of negative hardening against Beijing. In the past several years, we've had these attacks and so forth that are important. So you're right. I mean, this is a reality. But the administrations, when they want to deal with China, they often face this kind of situation with Congress, and they have to deal with it. And so they try to outflank it, or they have various ways of dealing with it if they want to. And so I think that one way to deal with it is, of course, to do lots of positive things with Taiwan in areas that are not sensitive. You can do all sorts of things. So what you might not be doing is things like this. Have the National Security Advisor of Taiwan come into the White House. You might not send your J2 two-star admiral from from Pacific Command to Taiwan and publicize it. You might not publicly talk about your transits to the Taiwan Strait. You might not. There's a whole series of things that this administration, Trump administration, has done that go way beyond the practice of the past. And so they go significantly beyond. They're incremental. They're significantly beyond. And so will those be continued? That's my basic point. And I see, and what I see on FTA is Mr. Biden doesn't want to do an FTA with Taiwan. Well, that would be the next step in the economic progress of the relationship, is to have an FTA. And he indicates that he's probably not going to do that. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Sarah, do you want to say something about U.S. leadership and multilateralism that you had raised about what the U.S. can do for Taiwan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to comment on one thing. I mean, we're certainly going to see different policies coming out of the Biden administration than from the Trump administration and from the Obama administration. You know, they're still formulating that. And Congress is going to be playing a big role in that. And we're looking forward to having those conversations and pushing. But I will say, you know, talk about tough language and strong actions and, you know, tough rhetoric. Those all have to be trying to achieve something. You know, tough language for the sake of tough language doesn't really do much for our allies and partners in the region. You know, we want to show tangible victories, tangible achievements. And so I expect what you'll see is a change in language and rhetoric for sure. I don't think we know yet what the change in policy is going to be if there are significant changes. And I'm talking about towards Beijing and also towards Taipei. I don't expect a major change in policy towards Taiwan. And we don't know yet what the policy positions of the Biden administration are going to be towards China. But I think one thing that Congress, and particularly Democrats in Congress, have been concerned about is rhetoric for the sake of rhetoric. And so you know, one thing we'd like to do is bring the rhetoric down and have more thoughtful policies with actual tangible goals in mind. And when it comes to Taiwan, you know, one thing that I think you've seen from, you know, the Taipei Act, which Senator Markey also was a lead introduction on, in ARIA and other bills, is that we don't want to view Taiwan only through the lens of Beijing. You know, we have a bilateral relationship unofficially, but, you know, we do have strong partnership in a lot of different areas. Economically, I mentioned the relationship, the wonderful relationship we've had in fighting the coronavirus pandemic. You know, we have a security relationship, military relationship. So all of those things, obviously the lens of China is there, but that's not the only lens through which we need to look at this. And I think when we talk about multilateralism, talking about a change in rhetoric, one of the changes in policies I hope we'll see in the Biden administration is a return to multilateralism. And just like you don't want harsh rhetoric for the sake of harsh rhetoric, you don't need multilateralism for the sake of multilateralism. There are actual benefits to reasserting our leadership in the region, not just in a unilateral way vis-a-vis China. And I mentioned some of those in my remarks, but there are very real things that have little to do with the kind of conflict between the Trump administration and China that we need to start looking at. And climate is a huge one of those that can't be dealt with unilaterally, has to be dealt with through multilateral fora, through alliances, and Taiwan will continue to be a partner on that. You know, just looking at human rights, you know, that's a really important part of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. You know, they're a strong leader on human rights and a democratic system in the region. And when you look at that versus what's happening in Hong Kong, you know, that relationship becomes even more important. And I think that's a big difference you're going to see. You know, you mentioned 2020 is not 2016. That's one of the starkest differences, I think, in the region when you look at the landscape now versus 4 years ago. You know, Hong Kong has become a completely different landscape. It's really highlighted in a very serious way Chinese abuses and their lack of commitment to their international agreements. And that's the reality that the Biden administration is going to have to face. Oh, you're on mute, Deepa.
Yes, hi. I have a follow-up on that, and that is that if the Biden administration dials back a bit on Taiwan. Do you see Congress taking a more activist role? In other words, a more leading role in favor of Taiwan should they see the Biden administration falling short in support for Taiwan?
I think Congress has always been an activist and leading voice in Taiwan, and I don't think that will change. And I also don't expect to see a pulling back from Taiwan. Again, rhetoric is not policy. And so just because, the language might change and the rhetoric might change, I think we have to look at actions. And, Congress is certainly going to be pushing to maintain the types of relationships that we've put forth in the Taipei Act, in ARIA, in the Fellowship Act that my boss introduced. And I don't expect that to change. We'll be looking at the policies, what are the things that we're actively doing? And we'll continue to push on that front the same way we did under Trump and the same way we did under Obama. I don't expect there to be a change in the way that Congress looks at this friendship between the US and Taiwan.
All right, thanks. And now, Hung Jen, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for Levy's comments. Regarding the first question, if I got the right questions, I think it's about Biden's image and how the United States, in terms of domestic politics, can do for Taiwan. For this question, I think, from my own opinion, I think at least from now to probably we will right now face around 2 years unstable situation, not only in the United States, but only in Asia. That means, from my opinion, I think Biden will bring some kind of unstable order in Asia, because we see right now Biden has strong challenges from its domestic issues. So a lot of things on its issue agenda on its table. So probably Taiwan and Asia's interest is not in his first priorities, in his preference lists. But the good thing is that we see the election results in Congress and House. We can see that there's a strong pressures from the Republican parties, not only in the Senator, but also in the House. Even right now, the House, the Republican parties lost some seats compared to Democratic parties. But during this time, the Republican gained several seats compared with the last times. I mean, much better than the last election result. So I mean, we have this impression in Taiwan that Republican parties always support Taiwan and has a strong support for a strong relationship between the United States and Taiwan. So I mean, this Congress and the Senate election results would kind of give a strong pressures for the Biden administrations to not so close to the PRC China. For the second question about how our Taipei representative Xiao Meiqing can do for the relationship between US and Taiwan, I think she can do a lot of things, not only because of her capabilities to do those priorities that authorized by Taipei, but also because she is kind of she's one of very close friend, very close partner to our President Tsai, and she was regarded as in the inner circle in DPP parties. So that means I think she will have more authority and power to realize all those policy decided from Taipei decision makers. So from that sense, I think Xiao Meiqing can do a lot of things. But the question is, what would be the first priority right now, and if she can resist those pressures from the opposition parties, KMT in Taiwan, because we see this time about the pork import already become big challenges to the DPP government, to Taiwan government. So that would be critical issues for Xiaomei to deal with, to make some kind of a bridge between conversation bridge between Taipei and Washington D.C. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Okay, Lev, did you have any other points you wanted to raise?
No, I very much appreciate everyone's response. I'm happy to let the Q&A go ahead and begin.
Okay, I just want to remind the audience to please post the questions in the Q&A section for us, and while staff is collecting these questions, if I may raise a question myself for the panelists. One of the things that we didn't talk much about was the in my view, I think that one thing we might see as changing between Trump and the Biden administration is somewhat of a shift from a geopolitical outlook to a more economic security, just because of the kind of domestic challenges that are happening here. And in that context, if these economic security and technological issues, if they become more of a competitive element between China and the United States, if in fact the next race between China and the US is in technology security, how does Taiwan stand to gain from that? And I whether supply chain security and whatnot, and this would be perhaps a question for either Bob or those of you, either Lev or Hung Jen in Taiwan? Who'd like to, whoever, jump in, whoever wants.
I could say something if that's useful. Just a few points on this, Deepa. The high technology competition has been highlighted by the Trump administration in their national security strategies. And this has been an issue in the Congress since at least 2018. It's highlighted in the National Defense Authorization Act that passed, which is a very important benchmark in the hardening of American policy toward China. So this is a real issue. It's been a real issue in the past 3 years as far as this the administration and the Congress is concerned. So Taiwan, as you say, it looms larger in this situation. It has assets that are very important in high technology, and it's not exactly clear where Taiwan's going to go. They seem to be leaning closer to the United States in this situation under the Trump government. It's an us or them type of situation, and they're interested in Taiwan being on their side. And I assume that the Biden administration would want that too. But they also have very close connections with Beijing, and so it's not clear where they're going to wind up. And so I think this makes Taiwan very get a lot of more attention than they would get otherwise, given the acute competition between the United States and China over our technology.
If I can quickly add, I think it's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, yesterday became the 9th largest company in the world, surpassing who did they surpass? They surpassed Berkshire Hathaway. So and they've made commitments to opening new factories in Arizona, and TSMC politically in Taiwan is much more closely connected with the DPP than, if there's a comparison to be made, Foxconn and TerryGo to the KMT. So if there is a sort of technological advantage that Taiwan currently has, is that it is, to a degree, because of its semiconductor advantage, poised to have some position in the next few years while Tsai remains in power.
Okay. All right. If there are no more comments, then I will now turn to the Q&A. Thank you, audience, for being so patient. Staff has collected several questions, so let me just read out some of these questions, and I'll say if it's directed to one of the panelists or not. So the first question comes from Jonathan Wolfish. He's from the Legislative Strategies. And this is a question that we have touched upon a little bit, and it's on Hong Kong and the Chinese crackdown, and whether or not we can expect a Biden administration to kind of take more tacit or more explicit actions to show support for democracy and by extension for Taiwan as well. And what would those actions look like? So this is a question for, well, I suppose it could be Bob as well as perhaps for all of you, but particularly for Bob and maybe Sarah on what we can expect on Hong Kong.
Maybe Sarah would like to go first, because Congress has played a big role in this, and so she feels comfortable doing that.
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, I think the Hong Kong issue has really kind of galvanized bipartisan support for a human rights and democracy-focused policy towards the region. And Congress has really had to be, I think, the driving agent under the Trump administration to almost force a serious consideration of what we should be doing surrounding Hong Kong. And that's, there's obviously been a big focus on China by the administration, but there's been less of a focus on human rights. And so the crackdown in Hong Kong has been an interesting, I think, connection of those two issues. And it's forced the administration to look at human rights and democracy movements in a more serious way. I would not say that it's been sufficient. And I think Congress will continue to be pushing on that in a very, very serious way moving forward. I think the difference is we have an incoming administration that has demonstrated a very strong interest in talking about human rights and talking about why democracy is a keystone of their foreign policy. And I think there's going to be a lot of room to work together on that. I expect Congress will continue to be a driving force just because we have strong bipartisan support on that issue, and that will continue moving forward. But I think that you can't really look at the region right now without thinking about the change in status and the change in perspective on Hong Kong and really what that means for the entire Indo-Pacific. I think there's a lot of allies and partners who are very nervous about Chinese kind of exportation of authoritarianism, exportation of tools to crack down on dissent, to crack down on human rights. And that's something that the Biden administration, the incoming administration, has already indicated they're going to take very seriously. And that will be an important change because, frankly, that's been an area where the Trump administration has been sorely lacking.
Bob, did you want to add anything to that?
Nothing except that the Trump administration, as far as actions are concerned, took a lot of substantive actions, which was very unusual for them because, as indicated, they usually didn't pay attention to human rights issues. But they took a lot of actions in Hong Kong. So specifically on Hong Kong, I'm not sure what else they can do, or with Taiwan. I think Sarah's approach that they would look at the more broad threat that Beijing poses in surveillance technologies and promoting authoritarianism. And that might be the area where the action would take place. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't know what else they can do in that sense.
Okay, I just want to mention that I happened to see a tweet from Jake Sullivan a few hours ago that expressed deep concern about the crackdown in Hong Kong. So he's come out pretty strongly calling China out on that, just as an aside. So that might be, at least rhetorically, they're sending out some signals. All right, well, the next question comes from our friend Shelley Rigger from Davidson College, herself a leading authority on Taiwan. And this question, I think, is for Hung Jen and Lev, our Taiwan-based experts. And her question is, has the Trump administration reset the norms such that reaffirming longstanding U.S. policy statements, which were never abandoned officially, will be perceived as rolling back U.S. policy toward Taiwan by people in Taiwan or not. So Hung Jen and Lev. So in other words, has the Trump administration reset the norms?
I'm happy to answer. Please go first.
Whoever can.
You can go first, yeah.
So I think, hi, Shelley. I think that there's most certainly concern that anything short of what Trump has done will be seen as not enough in Taiwan's eyes. I think that the acceleration with which US-Taiwan relations kind of excelled over the last 4 years, I think there was a lot of good, but I think to some degree it was a lot of good very quickly, and verging on too much of a good thing too fast. And the problem is for Biden is, where do we go from here in a way that still shows firm commitment to the policies that again have by no means been abandoned, but of trying to return to a normal that was never, like you highlighted, Shelley, was never really gone. I think the way that I describe it is that the US-Taiwan relationship is still going to continue to grow, but it is likely to grow at a more at a decelerated rate relative to where it was the last 4 years. I think one example to give is in arms and weapons sales. So under the Trump administration, there was just about as many arms and weapons sales in terms of US dollars as there were under Obama's 8 years. So by no means are there not going to be weapons sales under Biden, but I anticipate that the rate at which we see kind of these, either whether it's arms sales, diplomatic visits, will be at a less accelerated rate, which is still a perfectly normal US-Taiwan relationship, but relative to what people perceive here will probably be perceived as less.
Would you like to add something, Hung Jen?
Yes, I won't say that President Trump reset the norm, but I agree that President Trump kind of changed something. Maybe all of the things he changed are to the interest of Taiwan people. I think people here understand that not everything Donald Trump have done actually is for the good of Taiwanese people or for Taiwan. But actually, I think President Trump kind of break the rule and kind of undermine the conventional understanding of politics. For example, the relationship between United States, China, and Taiwan has been kind of constrained by this One China policy. So, but since Trump's administrations, President Trump kind of tried to push the limitation of this One China policy. So I think not too long ago, the Trump administration, especially acclaimed by Secretary of State Pompeo, saying that the United States never recognized that Taiwan is part of PRC China. So that's kind of change our conventional understanding of this One China policy as well as the status quo between Taiwan and mainland China. So from that point of view, I think that kind of gave Taiwanese people, or specifically Taiwan government, a good opportunity to resist some pressures from Beijing, specifically regarding this reunification agenda that Beijing tried to promote to Taiwanese people. Thank you.
And thank you for that question, Shelley. We had Shelley on our last roundtable. So, all right. Actually, there's a question just to continue on and maybe wrap up on the Hong Kong one to come for a minute. There's a question about Congress's role in addressing the fears of places like Taiwan and Hong Kong about abandonment. And the question comes from Ian Chong, a professor at the National University of Singapore. And his question is to Sarah, and he wants to know whether or not there are any specific legislative processes or congressional functions that can be used to do this. I'm assuming he's asking to step in against abandonment. But Sarah, are you aware of any such legislation?
So I think, legislation towards Taiwan and towards the region in general has typically been either all-encompassing, something big like ARIA, which was very bipartisan, which integrated Taiwan into the proposed Indo-Pacific strategy. And I would expect those types of efforts to continue. Or there's been kind of smaller efforts focused on very specific parts of the relationship. And that would be something like my boss's bill, the Taiwan Fellowship Act, which would kind of increase the people-to-people exchanges between the United States and Taiwan. I don't think I'm very sensitive and, understand the fears that people may have in Taiwan or in Hong Kong about abandonment. There's nothing that I've seen that suggests to me that an incoming Biden administration has any intent to abandon, US-Taiwan relationship or abandon our policies towards Hong Kong. I think Congress is going to work in concert with them to make sure that we're providing the right legislative framework and most importantly, the funding to continue those strong relationships. And so I think the answer to the question is, we passed funding bills every year. We've been very fortunate because of Senator Markey's leadership. We've been able to have really strong funding for the strategy laid out in ARIA. So funding for Indo-Pacific activities like democracy strengthening, like building military relationships, like cooperation, peer-to-peer programs, and that will continue. And that's a really important function that Congress can play. And then, we talked a little bit about the role Congress played on Hong Kong. When we see something where we think that any administration is not meeting the challenge or is deficient in its response, Congress steps up. And particularly when it comes to Taiwan and Hong Kong, that has been the case. And I expect that to continue. I can't look into the future and see, what particular issue might rise, but I don't think you're going to see a lack of engagement on the region from Congress just because there's a change in administration. I think our engagement will continue, our pressure will continue, our close cooperation will continue, and hopefully in the near future, our travel can continue because that is honestly a really important part of the relationship. I've visited Taiwan on a staff delegation trip. Many congressional staffers have. Usually lawmakers are traveling back and forth. And as you mentioned in the Taipei Act, that's a big part of that bill, is making sure that there's, high level engagement between the US government and Taiwanese officials. Obviously the pandemic has impacted that, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we can restart.
Low number of refugees allowed into the United States. And as a result, for my own original survey research, we see that Hong Kongers actually place the United States almost last in places they would want to try to flee to. And I think if there is a hope for the question was on abandonment. I think if there's something that the United States can try to do under Biden is to one, reopen the idea of the United States being seen as a refugee nation, and specifically showing to Hong Kongers who we've seen just in the last couple of weeks are now fleeing Hong Kong in seemingly record numbers, just politicians and protesters alone, seeing the United States as a more valuable option.
Excellent point. Let's hope Biden is listening to you. And to continue, I have several questions on the Trump versus Biden questions here. This one is from Tina Chung, Voice of America. And this is posed to all the panelists, whoever wants to jump in. But her question is that Beijing has been strong-arming countries and businesses to follow its one China principle on Taiwan, and has repeated its position that the U.S. is violating its commitment under the three joint communiques in its closer engagement in Taiwan under Trump. So the Trump has been, as Tina says, Trump has been tough and clear in pushing back on this. And the question, of course, is, do you see the Biden administration doing this kind of countering and pushing back on China's narratives or not? several questions related to this. And one is that, if China were to step up the military pressure from PLA towards Taiwan, how would the Biden administration handle hard military pressure? So first one is on the discourse, I suppose, and second one is on a harder military pressure from China, and how would the Biden administration respond? Bob, perhaps we might have to start with you, given the question.
Let me just, I'll just try to be brief on this. On the rhetoric and pushing back, the Trump government has just done extraordinary things to support in diplomatically. When you get the State Department, the Secretary of State sending a message about Tuvalu to support Taiwan, this is a remarkable thing, and that's what Mr. Pompeo did. When Tuvalu was perhaps moving toward Beijing, he weighed in, and the Vice President weighed in the Solomon Islands, this type of thing. I'd be really surprised if the Biden government did this kind of thing. I think this is something that was a big advance. The U.S. has been taking, the U.S. State Department people have been taking Taiwan delegates to countries to build cooperation, even though those countries don't recognize Taiwan. And so they're really going out of their way to counter the approach that Beijing takes to isolate Taiwan diplomatically in a lot of notable ways. And so, as far as this is concerned, I would think that we've already discussed this, that the rhetoric is one thing, and what these actually symbolic actions mean is not terribly substantive. And so perhaps the Biden people will be less prone to do this kind of dramatic display. On the military side, I'm mulling that question over myself. Obviously, DoD has its rules and regulations and patterns and practices of what they do in response to various actions by the PRC. We've seen a consistent sort of back and forth. The PRC will do an action against Taiwan militarily, and the U.S. will do a counteraction in one way or another. Will that sort of thing continue? I suspect it will. But I clearly don't know. And in the past, most of these things were done quietly. They wouldn't be publicized so much. And but they have been very publicized during the Trump administration, and perhaps they won't be now. So these are just speculation points from my part.
Anybody else on this question? Jump in about how the sort of related question is about the way in which, under Biden's more economic agenda, perhaps, how he's going to balance this military pressure versus the economic. And also, could be for Hung Jen. How has the Taiwan public been responding to, of course, the Trump's pushback versus what they expect from Biden as well? Hung Jen?
Yes.
Yeah, the question is, Taiwan's the public on how they have been responding to Trump's pushback with China, and then what the expectations about Biden's expected reactions. China's hard pressure. Yeah.
The public views, of course, they are very welcome to President Trump's this way to deal with China. I mean, this strong position, or this strong position in terms of sending very clear message to Beijing. So it's very welcome. It's very popular, accepted by Taiwanese public. But I think that's the problem here, because right now, Taiwanese people, they don't have this, they have ambiguous feelings toward Biden's administrations, because right now, so far, I can hear about from the solution from the Biden administration, this potential new administration, is to open the dialogue between not only between the United States and PRC China, but also between Taiwan and mainland China. So I'm not sure what they can talk during these several different types of dialogues or forums. But I think one thing I can share is that from the perspective of Beijing, they just want to hear that President Biden can say that the one China policy is still working, is still the policy, is still the China policy, is still one important policy toward Taiwan. That's kind of the key issues Taiwanese public would most worry about. Thank you.
So related to this is, of course, the question of strategic clarity versus ambiguity. And as we've seen, one of the questions from a GW student is about this, that Trump has been following much more clarity, strategic clarity versus ambiguity. And so do you see this, the Biden administration sort of going back to an ambiguity, and will that be enough? Will that work with China? This is for Hang Jen, or also for Bob or Lev or Sarah. But maybe Hang Jen, do you want to continue with this?
I think as Biden mentioned after the elections, right now is the different age, different timing from that of Obama administrations. I don't think it's good enough to just go back to these ambiguous strategies toward China. I don't think things can go back again, because right now the President Trump already set these standard layers. So I don't think it's just enough to satisfy Beijing's motivation or Beijing's intention only by saying again this one China policy. I think they want more from the United States to practice, to realize this one China policy. That from some point of view from Taiwan, it's kind of a dangerous or risky to challenge this triangle relationship between Taipei, Beijing, and Washington, D.C.
Bob, can I ask you on this, the strategic clarity versus ambiguity, and whether Biden can actually go back to it and whether that's going to work, basically China?
I guess I would say I don't think we've abandoned strategic ambiguity. I think strategic clarity requires a whole bunch of things that really haven't been done. So I think my argument would be that against those who argue for having strategic clarity is why do it? And it seems to me that what we had is an ambiguous situation, which has more or less worked for the past 70 years in a lot of different ways. And so I think it's making this isn't even for the Trump government. This was not done. They didn't say this categorically, and to end the strategic ambiguity. And so and what Hun Jen was talking about on communiques, the one China policy, that's something that Shelley, I think, was alluding to as well. This is something the Chinese government always wants. They always want the incoming president to reassure them that the three communiques are the basis for the relationship with China. And that is the one China policy. And as Hun Jen said, that will upset people in Taiwan. And yet I'm not sure how you can avoid that. I think Mr. Biden is going to have to do that in one way or another. Donald Trump eventually did this, as you may recall, in 2017 in a sort of a backhanded way. But he never really did it. He never, as far as I know, I don't know publicly if he said that I abide by the one China policy and the three communiques. I'm not sure he ever referred to that. And so and yet that's what Beijing wants. And so I think they would be satisfied if they got that. I don't think they may want more, but I think they really need that assurance at this point. I think the Beijing has been, during the Trump administration, I don't think they ever had it. And so this would be a step forward for Beijing, I think, in this, if they would do it. And it would have the negative effect, as we discussed, in responding to Shelley's question. That if the president does this, then it's going to be automatically seen in Taiwan as a step back.
Since we are out of time, Bob will have had the last word. And I just want to say that I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, discussions, the questions. And I want to thank Bob, Sarah, Ungen, and Lev for joining me on this panel and going out on a limb to give some of their predictions and speculations. And we won't hold you to them, but we'll hope to have you all back, maybe in 6 months, to assess where we are at that point. So thanks again to my panelists, and also thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. Please make sure that you all sign up for the Sigur Center's YouTube channel so that you can hear this video and our previous Taiwan Roundtable recordings. And have a great holiday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.